Well, we apologize for a delay in the start of this, but I'd like to welcome everyone. Thanks all for registering and showing up this afternoon to this really special opportunity to hear from our state senator, Bruce Tarr, about climate initiatives at the state level. By way of introduction, my name is Valerie Nelson. I'm a member of the Cape Ann Climate Coalition and organizing committee, and my co-facilitator on this meeting is Dick Prouty, who's also a member of the coalition and chair of Town Green. So really, thank you so much, Bruce, for coming today. This is our second annual review with you about what's going on down at the state, the administration, and the legislature. And it's both about net zero transition and climate adaptation and resilience. So for all of you who are here now, we have four main segments about the budget issues, about flooding issues, about the Mass Save program, and about the national grid capacity issues. So, you know, this meeting is going to be recorded. You saw that. We'll send out a link, and we may have audio problems here with Bruce down in the State House. So when he starts talking, he may go and cut off his video. So if that's happening, you'll understand that that's the technology that we're dealing with. As you said, Bruce, in the State House, you would think that Wi-Fi would be perfect. But anyway, so let's begin. Dick, you're the first question on state budget and what's going on down there.
Welcome everybody. Welcome, Bruce. Thanks for the time. I'm going to start by sharing a slide of the whoops. So this is bills in 2023 that Senator Tarr either sponsored or co-sponsored, and that the CACC legislative group, of which I'm a member, and our fearless leader, Marcia Hart, has done a very good job of helping us understand what's happening with all the legislation. So Bruce, thank you for co-sponsoring and sponsoring these bills. And I'm not going to take the time to go through them all, but there are a lot of very important bills here. So thank you so much. Now I want to go to the question for the next 10 minutes.
You're welcome to it.
Yeah. The question we'd like now for 10 minutes is for you to talk about the recent budget cuts that Senator Healey was triggered to initiate because of the December revenue shortfall, and what they've affected. We know the earmarks were cut 50%, but what else do you think will be affected? And especially if this continues as it seems in January, the shortfalls are continuing. So what is happening? Can you tell us what is happening in the State House, with Democrats and Republicans, and what are the proposals to deal with these ongoing shortfalls? And how would that affect climate?
Sure. So Dick, I'm going to shut off my video just to make sure that you can hear me well.
Okay.
And so I think we have to understand all of this in context. And part of the context is that over the last several years, we've been experiencing phenomenal rates of income tax and capital gains tax and other kinds of tax revenue. And they'd allowed us to grow the budget in very significant numbers and also to put some money away for a rainy day. But now what we're seeing is a decline in the rate of those increases in revenue. And so by that, I mean, we're not looking anymore at 5, 6, 7% rates of growth of revenue over the prior year. But it's important to remember that we're not in negative numbers either. So what we're projecting now is somewhere in the order of magnitude of 2 to 3% increases in the amount of revenue collected going forward. But we are not predicting that we're going to go into a negative number of collecting less than we did in the prior fiscal year. So where that transition is happening is in the current budget for FY24, where we see that revenues are underperforming the benchmark that the budget was based on. And again, it's important to understand that doesn't mean that we are in negative numbers in terms of collecting less than we did in the year before. It means we're collecting less than the number upon which we based the budget. And so under the Massachusetts Constitution and under our statutes, the governor has an obligation to maintain a balanced budget, just as we have an obligation to pass a balanced budget. So in order to do that, she is given extraordinary powers to make unilateral cuts to the budget. And that's what has most recently happened. But the reason all of that happened, and I give her credit for not waiting until a crisis occurred, it was projected that we are going to be experiencing a shortfall of about $1 billion below the number the budget was based on. And so realizing that, she exercised her unilateral powers to cut the budget by about $375 million. And what you see that expressed in a lot of ways that's visible to us are local earmarks, things people put into the budget to reflect local priorities in their districts. And as you know, the Cape Ann Climate Coalition has directly or indirectly in the past benefited from some of those earmarks. So the governor reduced them all by approximately 50%. She did not zero them out. And she also reduced other programs, the most significant one being Mass Health or Medicaid, which is one of the major drivers of the budget. And the governor was able to find some savings because folks are being redetermined right now after the COVID-19 emergency regulations that made Medicaid available to many more people that would normally be eligible. So as a result of those reductions, she's able to find some savings there. And she's also making up the difference, the other $600+ million, by using other sources of revenue, intercepting, for instance, the interest on the stabilization fund and interest that's being earned in other ways that would normally be revert back to the stabilization fund. She's going to intercept those funds to be able to keep the budget balanced. And also we do earn interest on the budget itself. So she's going to take some of that interest and use that. And when you put it all together, that equals $1 billion. Now, the major question here on Beacon Hill is that reduction and that change in the budget going to be sufficient to get us through the end of the fiscal year, which ends at the end of June? We think it probably is, but we're not sure. And there are some variables, not the least of which involve the cost of addressing the migrant crisis, which is projected to require at least $1 billion over the next 18 or so months, maybe even a little bit shorter than that. So we don't know the answer to some of those variables, but we think that the changes that the governor has made will probably get us through the end of the fiscal year. Now, what that means is for a lot of accounts, and I'm not going to try to recite them all here for you because I would use up all the time that we have, and it would be a little bit dry to say the least. But what that means is a great number of things are being reduced. Most are not being reduced to zero. The amount is being reduced. And that will have an impact across the board. And we can share with you, perhaps we could get it to you, Dick, the comprehensive list of everything that's being reduced. I actually posted it on my social media, but we can also give it to you so you can share it with the members of the coalition and the people that are in this meeting tonight. So we think that we've reached a relatively stable point with these reductions, but going forward, we've established a new projection. And the Secretary of Administration and Finance and the House and Senate chairs of the Committee on Ways and Means have adopted a joint revenue projection for fiscal year 25, which is the one that begins on July 1st, of about 2.9% increase over what we have this year. So again, we're talking about a much lower rate of growth. And so the governor's budget proposes increasing spending by 2.9% before you use the funds from the surtax on income, the so-called millionaire's tax. So when you spend that money, the number for total spending goes up by 3.7%. And the point that I would again stress is the number is not going down. It is not going up as much as it has in prior years. Now, one of the things I know we all will be interested in on this call is what does that do for environmental protection? And the governor's budget as presented maintains her commitment to spend no less than 1% of the total budget on environmental programs and environmental stewardship. But bear in mind, that budget has a long way to go. So I'm going to stop there because I've said a lot.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very helpful. I just have one brief question, then we can transition to the next. And that is, we're all very interested in the emergency preparedness earmark that you secured for us. And was that one of the 50%ers, or did it somehow escape the scalpel?
So we're researching that, Dick, because it was not per se a local earmark, because we treated that as a regional appropriation. Yeah. And I do not believe it was sacrificed, but I need to double check that.
Yeah, I didn't see it on the list, so I wondered if that was what happened. So thank you very much for researching that. And we'll look forward to the list. And that's very helpful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure we all did. So Valerie, take it away.
Can I just do a brief follow-up? Bruce, you mentioned environmental protection. How much of that relates to climate projects that are funded? And how are those climate-related initiatives being affected preferentially or not, do you think?
So with that 1% of the total budget, a lot of climate change and resilience programs will be funded because they're being funded through the agencies, through Coastal Zone Management, through Department of Environmental Protection, through the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So I think they'll still be well supported, Valerie, but where I think if there's going to be a sacrifice, it will probably be in individual large initiatives. But a lot of what's been started will continue. And I do need to point out, and I should have pointed it out earlier, it's important to remember that the governor's budget proposal is only the first step. And it is just that. It is a proposal, but the budget has a long way to go. So right now, the Senate and House Ways and Means Committees will soon begin hearings around the state on the budget. And then the House will take up the budget in April, and the Senate will take it up in May. And only then will we have a sense of what the budget is really going to look like. And just to take it a step further, the Senate will pass a version of the budget that will undoubtedly be different than the House. And then we'll go to conference committee and reconcile that. And then that has to be accepted by the House and the Senate. Then it goes to the governor, and the governor has a line item veto authority, so she can send back vetoes. So this is something that isn't going to be settled for quite a long period of time.
Well, and I think all of us on the call are here to weigh in that we hope the climate-related mitigation and adaptation measures are maintained. So let's go on, and I think you're hearing that. So on to the flooding question. You know, we all experienced some things here recently, and I wanted to ask you because I've seen you over the years over at Plum Island. Your suit on and all that, and that was really grabbing most of the attention. But now I wanted to ask you, what are you seeing now? Have the flooding problems been changing in recent years? And you're out there all the time. Can you tell us what's going on with sea level rise and flooding from your on the ground experiences?
So I absolutely can. And one thing that I would say, Valerie, is that this is a situation where we saw a lot of inland flooding over the last couple of storms. And what we're seeing is the storms are tending to be more intense. The amount of water that's being precipitated is greater. And one of the most significant things that I've been seeing is that there is a very short period of time for these rainfall events. So we're getting a lot of water very quickly. And that is overwhelming the systems that are intended to manage rainfall events. So storm drains, sewage treatment plants with combined sewer overflows, culverts, dams, all of the infrastructure that we have that's intended to deal with stormwater. Over the last year, we've seen a number of rainfall events where those things were overwhelmed. And so, yes, we often see situations on the coast. You know, I'm oftentimes on Plum Island or Salisbury Beach. That's primarily because they have a lot of sand infrastructure that becomes eroded in these events. And it really doesn't happen inland because we don't have a dune ecosystem. And so it oftentimes is most dramatic at the coast. I would contrast that with Cape Ann, where we actually do have a lot of rock as opposed to dune infrastructure. We do have some, and we do lose sand volume, but not to the extent that it has been lost in other places over the last several years. But my main point on this subject would be the intensity of the rainfall events we are seeing is causing flooding in places where either we've never seen it before or it is rare to see it before. And the example that I would use, and this was in the news as well, and I was there for quite a long number of hours when these events happened, was a couple of storms that occurred that affected North Andover, which is also a part of our Senate district. And there's a downtown area with a couple of mill buildings that have been developed, and it's incredible to see what's been done with the reuse and adaptation of those buildings. But the flooding incidents there did incredible amounts of devastation to the infrastructure, and businesses were totally devastated. We had in North Andover at least one elderly housing complex where people had to be evacuated, and we had at least 2 dams that were compromised. They didn't breach, but they were severely damaged. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about in terms of infrastructure across the board and in many other places that we're seeing that kind of damage. And one of the things that has happened, and it really became obvious in North Andover, is that despite the work that was done by the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency and all of the estimates and surveys and all the things they needed to do, we still did not meet the target, that the threshold that's set by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And there was no federal relief, either in those communities or in the coastal communities or anywhere in Essex County, because we didn't hit the threshold. And that is a concerning issue that a lot of folks are trying to address. And the way that it's being manifested the most on Beacon Hill is the thought that we need to have a Massachusetts emergency disaster fund so that at least in the first instance, we can respond. Now, hopefully we would be able to get federal reimbursement for that. Hopefully we'd be able to put into one of those funds federal dollars that we could get in advance. But there is a clear desire on Beacon Hill to be able to, number one, move more quickly, and number two, act when the federal government does not act. And part of that, and this is more of a longer term project, is to establish a different paradigm, a different working relationship between the Mass Emergency Management Agency and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So maybe we can try to change the rules and expedite funds flowing, expedite eligible projects, but also, and very importantly, is the notion of trying to get additional federal funding for what is known as hazard mitigation, which is to say, when we see a place that is flooded repeatedly, we know that it's vulnerable. We know that its current design is not adequate to keep pace with the events that we're seeing. There is a federal program for hazard mitigation, but oftentimes our projects have not been eligible. And so there's a really strong thought here on Beacon Hill that we need to make sure that we try to change those rules and try to empower our communities and our property owners to be more proactive. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, we can go back. I wanted to ask you about this uptick in attention from the state, but just going back to Cape Ann, I wondered what we didn't have the inland flooding, what your take on was what happened. And I want to particularly ask you that yesterday I drove by your family farm and I had heard about your Greek grandparents and great grandparents. And, a lot of this is personal choices that people with homes will be making. What are you thinking about the future of your family farm?
Well, I'm thinking about sustainability, and I'm thinking about the fact that that farm has been there since a little bit after the turn of the century, trying to think about how we can do better with stormwater management, how we can be more proactive in terms of stormwater detention, and thinking about all of those tools. And again, I think it's easy when you've had something that's been around for a long time to think that that will necessarily mean it will endure for a long time in the future. And that's something that I think we need to come to grips with, that we need to be proactive. And that's what we're trying to think about on the farm as well. And I think many people are trying to think about that. There are a couple of difficulties. Number one, it's hard to think about needing to change when something's been so well established for so long. But number two, there's also the consideration of how does the engineering come about for more complex solutions, and how does it get funded? And that's where I think that we would do well to look in the direction of, if we take actions now in strategic, engineered ways, they could well save us a lot of money in the future in terms of insurance claims or public assistance.
And Bruce, I asked that because I should have said, when I drove by, the flooding was clearly at the wastewater treatment plant in the mobile station. I don't know how many feet elevated you are, but you could see some substantial storm damage as well. So thanks for that answer.
So Valerie, let me just say that in my conversations with Mayor Verga, I was surprised at the amount of damage that occurred on Cape Ann in those most recent flooding events. And it was primarily due to flooding, due to inundation, due to erosive effects of flooding, due to property damage and structural damage due to flooding. And I was quite surprised. And so there was extensive damage on Cape Ann. There was some erosion, but erosion wasn't the principal form of damage. The principal form of damage was damage due to inundation from water.
And of course, we didn't have the big waves and winds that we would get in a really serious storm. But the other thing I wanted to point out to the audience is I know that, not only were you at Plum Island observing, attending to things, but you were trying to get into the budget funding, not only for dams, but coastal projects, trying to get pilot projects, things funded. So now, how could you describe the level of attention that the state government is now giving to this problem? I assume you should be happy with, you're not the lone advocate out there anymore. This is a big deal for the state.
It is, and I don't feel alone at all, Valerie. I feel like there is new attention being paid to this. As you know, I was one of the folks that worked to put together the dam and seawall fund that we currently have, and that has been funding projects on Cape Ann, like the Haskell Dam, and some of the other infrastructure projects that we have. But I think now we are looking even more at how to accelerate those and how to increase that investment. And we're looking at it now, I think, in a different way. So in the past, we looked at things that were deficient as conditions currently exist. So for instance, we knew that the Haskell Dam had deficiencies, had structural questions that needed to be addressed. But now, not only do we look at current deficiencies, but we look at what shortcomings these structures might have in the future, given what we may see in terms of changing patterns of storms and other kinds of things that are being occasioned by climate change. So I think there's not only been a difference in the number of people that are attentive to this, there's been a change in the mindset to say that this isn't a static situation anymore where we can say, okay, we have X number of dams that are deficient across the state. Now we say, okay, how many more dams will be in jeopardy if the water levels that those dams are protecting and holding back increases significantly? It's that kind of change.
And
I
also
think,
building
Valerie,
an infrastructure along the coast. So do we move on, Dick? Is it
yeah, I
time?
think it's time to move on for our next question.
Okay, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Susan, I think you got to go, but you're muted.
Sorry, everybody, I'm not quite on target here. Thanks, Bruce, for listening to us, and we'd like to share some of our experiences working with the Mass Save program. Let's start from the beginning. Funded by several Mass CEC grants over the last 2 years, Lisa and I have been working on building decarbonization with local income eligible renters and their landlords for 2 years. We chose this project, understanding that the building sector in Gloucester is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's Massachusetts' second largest source. Net zero cannot be reached either in Gloucester or Massachusetts without major changes in the speed of decarbonization of buildings. We've experienced significant confusion and barriers that have made this work extremely difficult. And we're not the ones that are providing the decarbonization. We're just trying to hook the renters up, many of whom have never been eligible for services before. Lisa has spent most of the time working one-to-one with these renters and landlords, and she's going to talk more about specifics. Lisa?
Okay, thanks, Susan. Hi, Bruce.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just going to share my screen right now. I have been doing one-to-one with renters. I just want to go over what kind of like the big picture of what's going on with low-income housing, specifically multi-units, and how we're trying to reach out to landlords and why this problem is so big, because we have to reach greenhouse gas emission goals by 2050. So right here, everybody can see this. In the United States, the majority of renters are low income. And then if you look at this pie chart right here, we're working towards electrification of homes, meaning they heat with electricity. Everything's done with electricity. We get off of fossil fuels. And in Massachusetts, the heating fuel type in households, there's only 18% of the pie is electricity. The rest is fossil fuels. So we want to get people off these fossil fuels. And if you notice, a little more than half the pie here, over 50%, is gas. People heat with gas in Massachusetts. So we want to bring that down to like 100% electricity. So we're mostly focusing on Gloucester on Cape Ann, but we'll help anybody in any town on Cape Ann who's a landlord or a tenant, or to try to help get their multi-unit through these energy programs, and we coach them through them. And the reason Gloucester is what we're focusing on the most, it's just because that's where most of the low income households live. And I have this statistic from the MAPC that 44% of the households in Gloucester are low income households. So that's a lot of households who don't have a lot of money, who don't have the money to decarbonize. And a lot of people who are low income rent, and I got a spreadsheet from the assessor's office at from Gloucester City Hall, and there are 1,864 multi-units in Gloucester, and most of them are small, like 1,335 are 2-family and 359 are 3-family, and the rest are more than 3-family. So these are, landlords, mom and pop landlords. They're not big money who need to do this work. And people who live here know that our buildings are old and they need this work to get done so we can reach our greenhouse gas emission goals by 2050. Because 80% of the buildings that are here now will still exist in 2050, and we really need to decarbonize. And so the program we work with is the income eligible program through Mass Save. And what it does is if there's 50% or more tenants in a multi-unit, well, household, 50% or more income eligible households in a multi-unit, they can go through and get the free energy work with lots of benefits done on the whole building. The landlord can get the whole building done. If it's less than 50%, they gotta do it with like 1 unit market rate, one unit income eligible. And the only way to really become income eligible is to get on fuel assistance. And to get on fuel assistance, you have to go through the CAP agencies here in Massachusetts. We have Action here in on Cape Ann, and you have to apply for fuel assistance. And if you're on fuel assistance, you're income eligible. All right, so those are some of the stats. And so we've come up with some barriers. We've come up with many barriers. For one thing, if you're a tenant and your heat is included in the rent, you're not going to be income eligible. Even if your income guidelines fall within there, if you're not on fuel assistance, you're not income eligible. And that means your unit is off the list. And we lose a lot of landlords this way because they're mom and pop places. They have one heating unit for the whole building. So the landlord has to pay for the heat. And you know, the tenants are actually paying for the heat through their rent, but it's not, they say the tenant isn't paying for the heat. So that's one thing that holds the landlords back. And I just want to let you know, all these barriers kind of pile up and it loses momentum when the landlords are going through these programs. So you kind of get them interested, and then like this happens and that happens, and then they kind of, you know, they just lose interest because it just gets too complicated. And then another thing, here, we'll slow down a second. Another thing is that a significant number of income eligible renters don't know about the program. So we have to like identify them and let them know about the benefits and, you know, kind of help them through the process. And some of the people have a hard time going through the process just because it's kind of complicated for people. Some people don't have computers or access to computers. This one woman didn't even have email. And I mean, the only way that you can do it is either online or by phone, but you can't go in person to get help to do this stuff. And I know a lot of people do get on fuel assistance, but there's other people who just have a hard time getting on fuel assistance. And that's the entry into getting everything done.
Oh, Lisa, we're at about the 9-minute mark, about 3 more minutes.
All right. Okay. So I'll just talk about one or two other things.
And then you want Bruce to give his opinion on some Mass CEC.
Yeah, just 1 second. One thing I want to just say is that Mass Save will not let you get heat pumps, your gas furnace replaced with heat pumps because and that's keeping a lot of people from electrification. They'll replace it with gas. So and there's reasons to talk about this, but I don't have time because I want to talk to you first. So anyways, there's barriers, and it's not just us coming up with these barriers. We work with other groups that are doing what we're doing, and they're coming up with the same problems we're coming up with. So I just wanted to let you know, we're not just finding these out just ourselves. Okay, so go ahead, Bruce.
I think, Bruce, the idea, the question would be, do you have any insight into how to have Mass Save and CEC be more effective in helping the decarbonization programs that in overcoming some of the barriers that Lisa and Susan are facing?
Bruce?
He can probably hear you. What is it, Susan?
Well, one of the reasons that we're given through Mass Save and other agencies that the low-income people who have gas for heating are not eligible to switch to heat pumps is because they fear that the price that they will pay for their electric heat pump for heating would be more than they're paying for their gas furnace. And this does not take into consideration all the communities in Massachusetts that have mutual aggregation, like Gloucester has through Candace Wheeler and everybody else. It does not take into consideration that all these low-income people get 32% off their national grid bill, right? Because they're low income, and because they can get another 10 and 15% off if they join a community solar. So it's not really truthful that these renters will end up paying more if they switch from gas to electric heat pumps. But still, these people in the gas zone are not allowed to get them. And it's kind of discriminatory in my mind because they are low income. If you're a gas customer and you're a market rate, you can switch, no problem. And that's a little bit unfair. Lisa, do you want to explain this thing?
Okay, so this is a stackables we came up with, and it's a way to reduce your electric bill. So when people say electricity is too expensive, you say, well, first you got to do a good weatherization, then you have to get on community electrical aggregate program that will give you a really cheap base rate for your electricity. Gloucester has it, a lot of communities have it, but when National Grid does their numbers, they don't put this in there. They do it for like a higher number. And then another thing is that if you're low income, you actually get not 30% that I have on here, 32% with National Grid income eligible discount. They call it an R2. And then number 4, you can get community solar, and that you'll receive about an extra 10% discount on that bill. And then you can also get help with fuel assistance. This is for low income people that people say they can't afford heat pumps because the electricity will be too expensive. But if you follow these steps, for a good portion of the communities in Massachusetts, your electricity bill can get pretty low. So that's why we came up with, actually Susan came up with this.
So Lisa, we only have a few minutes left. By
So
the way,
anyways, it's just some of the things that are happening through the Mass Save program that are kind of discriminatory and that are keeping people who are low income back from decarbonizing their homes.
Thank you, Lisa and Susan. We have a few minutes left for the last question. Bruce, I don't know, the suggestion was you might use the phone number and call in if we still have problems. But the good segue from the Mass Save question, where the gas utilities still have a lot of authority here and whether there should be some change in running this project, is to transition into the whole question of the capacity of the electric grid and National Grid up here on Cape Ann to be able to absorb electrifying everything, and also renewable energy and new economic development. So we have a very general question for you, Bruce, about what's your understanding about the capacity of National Grid power system here and the problems with taking steps forward in electrifying renewable energy and economic development in general. Or calling in. I mean, basically what we're asking, which segues from Mass Save, is if we want to transition out of natural gas infrastructure onto the electric grid, it's not as easy as it sounds. And we have capacity issues here that, are causing increasing levels of concern around National Grid and the power infrastructure here.
So I think that this electrical grid question is very important. We had several questions. For example, Bob Meyer had a good question on batteries and the grid. Would you want to spotlight Bob? Bob, I'm sure he's still listening. So why don't you respond let Bob ask his question, and maybe Bruce could answer that. I think Bruce can text me as well. So go ahead. Tom, spotlight Bob Meyer for his question.
He is spotlighted and he's making signals, but I don't understand him.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, that was me trying to say, I can't unmute. So there I am now, okay? So the question is, like Cape Cod, which had a single point of failure and solved it with storage solution in P-Town, could we do the same thing for what EDIC is concerned about now with a single point of failure in Beverly? Instead of stringing more wire, shall we say, putting battery storage somewhere that would also do exactly what Cape Cod is doing, but also be prepared for future offshore electricity coming ashore.
Tom, can you unmute Harak?
Yeah, Tom,
I think-
unmute Harak, and there's Bruce now. Here we
I
are.
think we're on. This is quite a team effort. So I'm very frustrated because this is a subject that I think is incredibly important. But let me just begin by answering Bob's question. And the answer is yes. And there's a lot of discussion about developing microgrids all across the state that would be somewhat self-contained to be able to deal with situations like that. And there's a combination of tools that are being discussed. Batteries are certainly one. Flywheel storage is another. Probably not as applicable in our area, but pumped storage that would use water that would then turn turbines. But there's a lot of discussion about that. The issue is capacity. So most of the battery installations that we see, in my opinion, would not necessarily be able to handle the larger loads of, let's say, an applied materials or some of the other larger uses. So they'd have to be used in combination with things. But that is very much a direction of thought that we're going in on Beacon Hill about how to increase resiliency by using those kinds of devices. The other benefit to them is that we can store energy in those devices at times of low load. And so we can take advantage of the capacity that we have and then reintroduce that energy into the grid when we're experiencing times of peak demand. So there are a lot of reasons to look at that. There is one installation in North Reading that's being done by the Reading Municipal Light Plant, a municipal light company, where there's a combination of batteries, a diesel generator, which I know we don't love, but it backs up the batteries in case they fail. But the issue there is that we're only talking about 5 megawatts. And so that gives you a sense of scale. But if we were to connect a number of those in different places on Cape Ann, that would be very useful. I would suggest to you that we are in a similar situation as Cape Cod because we only have 2 supply lines coming and they basically come from the same source at a substation in Beverly. And this is a huge issue that we need to address. The Cape Ann Chamber is doing some work on this. GMGI is doing work on this, the EDIC. But one thing I want to stress to folks, in the 2022 law that I worked on with others on the climate and energy bill, we required the electric utilities to submit plans to address some of these issues. And National Grid yesterday was due to submit their plan. It's called Future Grid. And you can look on that on their website, on the National Grid website. But what you'll find is the only thing that really touches Cape Ann directly is the introduction of another 23 kV supply line into the West Gloucester substation. I don't mean to diminish that, but I think we need to do more. And what concerns me is that the lines, we do not introduce electricity onto Cape Ann from enough different directions. We're only coming from the south. We need to look at the north. We need to look at the west. And I think we all need to work together to move this conversation in a much better direction than just the addition of a single supply line. And I think everyone knows that I'm very concerned with the suitability of the grid overall to be able to accept all the renewable sources of energy that we're trying to create, number one, and number two, trying to supply all of the electrification that we're undertaking. And I am very, very concerned about the grid's ability to do that. And so I have a bill that would require a regular upgrade and a regular update on the status of the grid to meet those demands. And also, there's a bill that's been filed by Jeff Roy, who is the House Chair of the Committee on Energy and Utilities, that would do essentially the same thing. And Jeff and I are going to work together to see if we can move this. You may all know that a number of years ago, I worked on legislation that requires a 5-year rolling energy plan for Massachusetts, so that we're always looking at projected demand and how we're going to meet that demand. And I would like to apply that same methodology, that same ideology to the grid, because if we develop all of the new sources that we're hoping to develop, and if we're going to try to apply those sources, to local applications, if we don't have a good grid in the middle, we're going to be frustrated, and our efforts are going to be thwarted completely. So I think we've got a long way to go on this, and I think this is an incredibly important subject for us all to focus on now and in the future.
So is it fair to say, Bruce, that as the public, that this has been a sleeper of an issue? No one's paid attention to this, and actually it's one of the most important things that we better pay attention to. It affects our carbon emissions, it affects community solar, it affects the economic development. I hear stories about power going out on working waterfront businesses all the time, that this is a big deal for us. But how many years is this going to take to resolve, and what do we do in the interim?
So it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be inexpensive, and it's not going to be a one-time fix. What I'm suggesting is we need to get into the mode of constantly evaluating the grid and constantly upgrading the grid. And I do have a hard stop, as Dick mentioned, and I appreciate him mentioning that. So I'm going to leave you with this. The shortcomings of the grid are strangling economic development on Cape Ann right now. I'm sure that everyone's been reading about the intent of cell signaling technologies to move its national headquarters from Beverly to Manchester by the Sea. And right now, the grid will not support that expansion. And so, they're talking about order of magnitude, a couple of hundred jobs to start, scaling up to 600 to 800 jobs. And that scaling won't happen unless we're able to introduce more electricity onto Cape Ann, more supply. And so that's the canary in the coal mine. But the point is, if we're successful in creating the life sciences cluster that we're all working so very hard to create, we won't be able to support it unless we're able to build out a grid. So you got to have supply, but you got to have transmission and delivery.
And we can't
forget that.
transition. We can't transition off.
Just want to mention one. The phase 1 of the Harvard study identified solar sites for all of Cape Ann that would do about 2/3 of the electrical needs through microgrids. So I think that needs to be looked at as a research option. And of course, there would be all kinds of zoning and costs, so forth. Some of this is on public land, some of it's on private land. But that possibility would make us relatively independent of supply lines coming in if it would really buffer the supply line issues.
And what National Grid is doing is charging very high interconnection fees that make all of that not economical to do.
Well, so there's a twofold problem with interconnects right now. Number one is the cost, but number two is the delay. And there's also legislation to try to require those studies that need to be done for interconnection to be accelerated. So there's a lot to talk about here. Happy to talk about it more in the future. Unfortunately, I'm up against a hard stop, but I just want to say thank you to the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, number one, for everything that's being done. Number two, for being so communicative with me and Representative Ferranti and others in the region. And number three, for being such good partners as we try to conceive of things that will help and then make them happen here on Beacon Hill.
Well, thank you, Bruce, and we'll talk again, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for all who attended. Appreciate your coming.
Yep, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody.